When did we know that privatising the probation service, which supervises offenders, was a catastrophically bad idea? Was it when Justice Secretary Chris Grayling first ignored internal government documents warning it had a very high chance of putting the public at risk? Or was it when the Chief Inspector issued a damning report eviscerating the changes and warning that private companies were supervising 40% of their offenders by telephone instead of face-to-face meetings? Was it when the taxpayer had to bail out the private companies running this essential public service to the tune of £500 million? Or was it when it emerged the number of offenders recalled to prison for breaching licence conditions was up by nearly 50%? This is yet another example of how this government's determination to put public services at the mercy of the market is costing us more while making us less safe. They have rightly, but very belatedly, announced they'll take probation back into public ownership. But this is more than the latest manifestation of failing Grayling. This is why the Tory obsession with privatising public services needs to stop here.
Do you know, until the last few sentences, I thought, great, we're back together again. And of course you're right. And just touching briefly on our first conversation about Jeremy Kyle, a government that now wants to look into TV production, wasting £500 million on this. And there are claims in some of the papers today, and I won't name names, there's no problems, that they've lost people because killers or people who went on to be killers were allowed on the streets who shouldn't have been because of it. I mean, nothing gets more grave than that.
Absolutely.
However, to now say that all privatisation is wrong, because some have worked. And I just choose one. You're too young. I sense you're too young. This side of the room gets it. In the old days, when he was just after taking...
Are you going to talk about the winter of discontent?
No, no.
And
in the old days, just after he'd taken his 11...
yeah,
well, then it had some benefits. It had some benefits.
I was. Yeah.
Very briefly, that the revolution in telecoms in this country by privatisation has been fantastic. My colleagues on my left, I doubt Majid can. If you moved house, you might have to wait 2 weeks before, I think it was called the post office or whatever it was. The GPO could actually give you a phone line. That is how backward this country was. Are you right about this? Yes, you are. Are you right about all privatisation? I would argue you're not, because of an example such as telecoms.
No, but let's go back to this. Let's go back. I mean, the real question about this is how has Grayling survived?
You say
if any of us, we've been talking about we've all had jobs and we've all taken responsibility. If I had a job where I lose £500 million, which is what they've done, and it doesn't work, I would be slaughtered. Chris Grayling sits there just carrying on as if nothing's happened.
Do you know what?
Can we just have a look at Chris Grayling, because he's mentioned him? So yeah, let's go to see what he said.
It feels as if you've been sort of trailed, shall we say, with misfortune in the Department of Transport with the drones. Before that, in the Ministry of Justice, with very controversial cuts to legal aid, with issues with the probation service. Why do you think it is that this kind of misfortune seems to follow you?
Well, it's a challenging time for all of us in government. We have to deliver change. We have to tackle new issues, like the drones, for example. So it's a question of getting on with the job and tackling the problems as best you can. But at the end of the day, dealing with your financial positions and also dealing with particular challenges, like the expanding demand on the railways, you just got to get on with the job and do your best.
Now, of course, while the audience were watching him, of course, what they don't know is that all of us were in fits of laughter. How does somebody like that...
Do you know, back in 2012, the Ministry of Justice, before it was privatised, did a survey of all 35 probation trusts and marked them all excellent. They were all doing incredibly well. And you know, we're laughing here, but the serious point here is a lot of people, there are 250,000 people under the probation service, 3 times more than the amount of people that are in prison now. Those people desperately need the help of an efficient probation service, and they're just not getting it.
This is why, just to come back to your question, I broaden it out to privatisation. I didn't say there's no room for privatisation, but I said this obsession with privatising things, in this case, in the face of all available evidence.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, Grayling ignored his own department's warnings. They predicted exactly this.
You are exactly right. You are exactly right. And this is an ideological view of the world, and he decided, I can make my name by doing this.
It's an ideological obsession with privatisation, even when it fails the public, and that's what we need to challenge. Now, what other public services are being privatised, even when it's not in our best interest? That's what and you know, you might be right about telecoms, although I do remember recently private network providers are being now forced to compensate people when they don't have their broadband speed improved, because they weren't willing to do that. There are lots of failings in provision to rural services, and you know, I think to portray all privatisation as working well.
Can we agree? Actually, if the danger is ideological views, then the danger is ideological privatisation and ideological renationalisation. On both ends of the spectrum where people are ideological, there's a danger.
But there's this view, isn't there, that everything that's a public service is inefficient, and if we put it private, it's going to be efficient. And what efficiency actually means with these private companies is low wages and cutting staff. And that's exactly what's happened.
And what I really have in mind here is the NHS, because we all know that we live in a climate where the NHS is vulnerable. You know, these ideological forces of privatisation are all honing in on our National Health Service, and we need to learn these lessons before we end up, because the thing about the probation services, as you were saying, Carol, this is so serious. This is people's lives at risk. This is the service that keeps the public safe from people who've committed serious
my
violent
wife
crime.
is a probation officer, so I'll declare a personal interest, but I have to tell you, the idea, I've talked to one or two probation officers in the last few weeks about what's been happening, and the idea that it's all come down to how much profit we're making, which is what's happened. That isn't what this is for. And it really is a terrible mistake. And it's ideal, and grayling should have gone
So what about,
there's no doubt.
What about the railways, the national grid? Where do we all sit with those other things?
I would fear if the railways were renationalised. I would fear that, because I just don't think that would work.
They're currently privatised and being bailed out by us.
Again, it's because you won't remember that. I don't know, but I find it very difficult to be persuaded of the merits of going back to the days of British Rail. That being said, some of the rail operators, I won't name them, it's a racket, and the service is appalling.
National Grid?
I don't know enough. I don't know enough.
Mr. Dyke?
Well, I'm a bit like him about the National Grid. I don't know. Railways, well, of course, they will. You don't have to nationalise the railways. You just wait till the franchise is finished and you take them back. So it doesn't cost you anything.
Should they take them? You would take them all back?
I think I probably would, yeah.
I think the problem could be solved if we just got Chris Grayling off the political landscape, actually, because he's messed up every single department he's ever been in charge of.
You've dodged the question about about railways.
Well, I've had the privilege of the one asking the question. He doesn't have to.
That's why I'm throwing it back to you. Come on, mate.
No, I'm not comfortable with the railways.
Really?
But I don't know why. You know, whereas NHS, your point there, absolutely, and actually even with probation, absolutely.
But again, parts of the NHS, well, bits that are privatised, I mean, for instance, you know, you need a new knee, you can't get it through, the health service hasn't got enough, so actually they'll pay for a private
I'm in favour of that.
So
I don't mind
I'm not comfortable with renationalising.
I don't mind that. I wouldn't want to nationalise it.
I just think maybe part of the problem is I remember how bad the rail service was.
Okay.
So, yeah.
But shouldn't we have certain industries?
But I used to get...
Shouldn't there be certain industries that just shouldn't be touched, shouldn't be privatised, like the National Health Service, like the probation
I think in terms of everything else, I mean, I'm not ideologically obsessed with renationalisation either. I think at the moment we skew so much in favour of privatisation that we don't consider renationalising when it might be in our interest. So I would like us to take an evidence-based approach to each sector and work out whether we gain more from nationalising.
What's interesting about Grayling is that's what his department said to him. Let's test this in one area and see if it works. And he wouldn't do it.
He
insisted on pushing the
was clear.
It was
the evidence was clear. The 35 probation trusts were rated as excellent, and he messed them up.
Wow. It is extraordinary that he carried on, and what it does again speak to is that these are the people who so often lecture us as to how we should be living our lives, how we should be doing this, or what TV we're allowed to watch, and they can't even handle
it. And what accountability will they face? That's my question. Because it feels like there's no account. This is another catastrophic error by him, another flaw in their whole obsession with privatisation, and it's going to be business as usual.